Welcome to Face to Face, Connecting Theater Makers to the Public, a program from the Legacy Theater and socialdistancetheater.org.
Hi everyone, I am here with a very special guest today. Her name is Beth Dinkova, and she is the playwright and recent director of Rage, which is a play with music adapted from the Stephen King novel. And I had the honor of being Beth's stage manager of this production. As someone who has spent a lot of time with Beth, I can tell you that she is a fascinating person, and I'm so excited for you to learn more about her today. So, Beth, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Bulgaria and what the theater scene is like over there?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lauren, for inviting me for this interview. Well, I was born in a very small town in Bulgaria that is close to the Greek border. And I lived in Bulgaria up until I went off to the States to go to college. Needless to say, it was a very different kind of environment. Everybody knew each other where I lived early on. So I definitely felt like it was a big culture shock to go from a very small, somewhat rural, very close community to a country as diverse and as vibrant and as large as the United States. And in Bulgaria, the theater is very much aligned with the Russian theatrical tradition. So theater training there is very rigorous. There's a lot less new work happening, which is one of the difficulties currently with Bulgarian contemporary theater, that there aren't as many playwrights working and creating new things. So it's a lot of very exciting, very rigorous, and very innovative adaptations of classical works from the European canon, but not so much new things. So it was interesting for me to get immersed into a very different kind of environment through being in the United States for college first as a theater and psychology double major, and then in grad school at the Yale School of Drama, where I primarily started to work on new works. And in the process of working on these new works, I also discovered my passion for adaptation and taking on an existing work and reframing it and shifting it in order to create a new and burningly relevant conversation around it.
And so what about playwriting and directing specifically drew you to that field?
I actually started out in the theater somewhat late. In my tiny town in Bulgaria, there actually wasn't any theater. So the first theater I ever saw was when I went to the capital of Bulgaria for high school. And then I would go to the theater pretty much every day because I discovered such joy in being able to be present with other people in that particular way. I started directing in college, and it was fascinating to discover this feeling of having a calling all of a sudden, because I had had a lot of distinct interests from visual art through creative writing, through psychology, and I never thought that there was a discipline that combined all of them. And then when I started directing and then eventually writing, I discovered that I could actually create whole other worlds on stage. And that brought me great meaning.
Amazing.
So I think my relationship to directing started in that way. And I've always been writing and adapting things as I've been going. I just didn't get to acknowledge that I was doing that and that I was passionate about it until pretty recently.
So do you feel like your Bulgarian background has influenced your work?
Definitely. I would say it has, definitely in aesthetic and in political ways. The aesthetic ways in which it has influenced it have primarily been driven by thinking of a work of theater as a total work of art and a total immersive experience rather than centering the text as the most important thing. So I have always felt a little bit less beholden to the text, which is probably where my desire to always change it to suit my purposes has come from. And very much invested in creating really jarring and shocking and beautiful aesthetic containers for my work. As far as the political function, I think, of my work goes and how my Bulgarian background influenced that, both growing up in a small community and also growing up in a country that has gone through a lot of political turmoil made me really invested from a very early age in using the arts as a means of starting conversations and ultimately creating political change. And I feel like with who I am as an artist, there is no other option for me than to feel like I have to always be creating works that really have the potential to transform the discourse, at least in the hope and aspiration of it, even if not in the practice of it. And I find that being a bit of an outsider in the American theater scene is immensely useful because it allows me to look at these very American issues such as gun violence, which is one of the things that we'll talk about, I'm sure, a bit askance through a slightly different lens because I don't take these things for granted. So having been able to see different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of relating to people, I think is really useful in making the familiar strange and the strange familiar in order to learn something new about the lives we're living.
So to kind of just talk about your theater training a little bit. So I know that you went to Yale for your MFA in directing. Can you just speak a little bit about what those steps were to getting to that point and what that experience was like for you?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, the first time I came to the States was for college. So I went to read in Portland, Oregon, which was a very rigorously academic hippie school with a lot of very intense people who are also very invested in having very serious conversations about every world issue. After that, I did an apprenticeship at the Studio Theater in Washington, D.C. So I was their resident assistant director for all of their shows and also worked with the artistic director, David Muse, on various special projects, stage readings, and audience engagement events. And that was really the first time where I felt a real connection to new American works and playwrights because Studio is very focused on contemporary texts and creating very intimate and very electric productions of these. My co-workers at Studio told me about the Yale School of Drama because half of them had gone there. So they said, surely that's the natural next step. So I applied and I auditioned, even though I actually didn't have the minimum requirement of professional experience to apply. But somehow, miraculously, I formed a really great bond with Liz Diamond, who's the chair of the directing department there. And she let me in. So, and then within the Yale School of Drama, it's a fascinating program because the directors actually take classes with people from all other disciplines. In first year, we're mostly taking acting classes with the actors. Second year, mostly design classes with the designers. And then third year, we're sort of doing our own thing and working with a lot of resources. So it was a great way to explore what it feels like to tap into those different disciplines, tune into the nuances of collaboration, and also wield a bigger aesthetic palette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that sounds like such an amazing foundation. I have always believed that no matter what aspect of theater you decide to pursue, it's so important and valuable to have experience in multiple facets. So, Rage. So, why Rage? What about reading that novel made you want to adapt it?
My relationship with the novel Rage is long-standing. When I was growing up in Bulgaria, my parents had a whole epic shelf of Stephen King books. They were big, voracious Stephen King readers. And I couldn't wait to get old enough to be able to read those books. I think I started reading them earlier than one is supposed to because, my parents were working a lot, so I had a lot of alone time in the house. So if memory serves me, the first time I read the novel Rage was when I was 11 or 12 years old. So a little Bulgarian girl engaging with this work. And what really stood out to me then and what stuck with me was how personal and how intimate the journey of the novel was. For those of you who may not have read it, Rage is written in a diary form, and it's basically the diary of this school shooter who, after a couple of traumatic incidents in his life and a long and torturous journey through adolescence, ends up deciding to bring a firearm to school, murder his algebra instructor, and hold his classmates hostage. In the cycle of this hostage situation, he initiates this strange sequence of personal revelations for his classmates, where they get to share a lot of secrets and talk about the darkness that has consumed them in their own lives, to the point where this strange psychological inversion takes place, Lord of the Flies style, where the classmates end up turning not on Charlie the shooter, but on the most popular kid. Now, this revenge fantasy gone wrong was very appealing to me as a very anxious young person, because it was very disturbing to read it. It was very disturbing both because of the horror of the situation and the way in which that was right in your face as you were reading it, but also because the diary was written from Charlie the shooter's perspective. It was impossible for you to distance yourself as the reader from the experiences that he was going through, and not to think every step of the way, oh, if a person or multiple people or institutions had intervened at an earlier stage because there were so many signs that this kid was about to explode, then things could have gone quite differently. So initially, I think reading the novel, I just thought of it as this fascinating, scary, dark thing that helped me to grapple with my own demons and my own anxieties. I didn't really think back to this novel particularly until I came to the States, and I realized that what it seemed like a very fantastical scenario to me, which was the scenario of a kid bringing a gun to school, was actually people's lived reality in the States. And what I couldn't figure out as a newcomer into this American reality and this cultural phenomenon was how it could be that despite the mounting evidence and body pile that the accessibility of firearms is so widely, and especially to young people, is not a good idea, these tragedies, these school shootings happened over and over again. And I really felt compelled to try to figure out what I can do in order to bring this conversation into our minds in a way that felt personal and intimate, and that felt like the novel, where you couldn't disengage from it. Because the saddest thing about that conversation is that our outrage when these events happen is very strong and very quick to ignite, and our forgetting is equally quick. So it's a long story that has many fascinating twists and turns. In the process of trying to find the novel in English, I realized that I couldn't, because in the late 90s, Stephen King had pulled it from print after a series of copycat incidents where teenagers were attempting to recreate the scenario within the book with varying degrees of success. At that point, I thought that this idea of a writer confronting his sense of responsibility and having to figure out what to do with a problematic, but also a very truthful and very urgent work of art is kind of the same question that we're facing when we think about whose fault these situations are. Is a parent responsible for the actions of their child? Is a school psychologist responsible if they miss these warning signs? Is a gun manufacturer responsible for what people do with their weapons? So I decided to ask for permission, after a lot of self-dialogue and a lot of trying to build myself up to that point, to adapt not just the novel and the plot of the novel, but also the real story surrounding the novel and its history into a play.
That is amazing. So why did you add music to this play?
Music has the capacity to transform a person into a whole different world. And we all of us have really intimate and really strong relationships to songs that start with the physical state that music puts us in and continue with the personal associations that we end up investing in music. I was feeling that in the transformation of the journey of this play from a novel to a theater piece, there was a degree of intimacy when different students were telling their stories and sharing their secrets that was getting lost in a wider stage picture. And in trying to figure out how to really plunge audience members into the very personal and unique experiences of all these young people on stage, music was actually the most effective way to create that sense of really close connection and to sort of sync the heartbeats and the thoughts of the character and the audience member.
Yeah. And as someone who was able to see this show from its very first rehearsal all the way up until our final performance, I can definitely see how music added those layers that you're talking about, and how the music really carried all of the sensitive topics spoken about in Rage in such a beautiful way. So another thing that I'm curious about is, how did it work in being able to adapt Stephen King's novel? Did you have to reach out to him? Did he want any input in the show? How did that work?
I first reached out to Stephen King with the idea to adapt this show a couple of days after the Parkland shooting, when I think the entire nation was very raw and in a lot of pain, and really trying to figure out what we can do to actually make true on this promise that these sorts of things should never happen again. And I felt that at that point, I just couldn't keep sitting on this idea and waiting longer. It felt kind of irresponsible to not to try to take some kind of artistic action. Well, for one, I was shocked that I even received a response at all. But what was even more shocking and beautiful was Stephen King and his representatives' generosity in the course of our process. Basically, I had to do an initial draft of the script, and at that time it was still just a play, and it was the long durational 4-hour version probably of the play that some very dear actors in Atlanta ended up sitting through in my living room in order to help me figure out how to make it better, that Stephen King initially read. And from that point on, once he had sort of given his initial agreement for me to take on the project and continue with the adaptation, it ended up being more about finding a concrete opportunity and a way to really get the resources that I needed in order to develop the script further.
So, to just talk a little bit about the rehearsal process, was that what you imagined it to be? And if not, how did you think it was going to be different?
I'm not even sure exactly what I imagined before we got going. I always knew that it was going to be challenging because of the really complicated and difficult and personal subject matter, because the script deals not just with gun violence in schools, but also with bullying, with mental illness, with sexual assault, with police discrimination and brutality. So it's like a serving platter of tragedies and social ills that ended up being very personal to a lot of the cast members. And one of the main priorities in organizing the rehearsal process for me was not simply to create a good show, but also to make sure that everybody involved in it can actually have the kind of cathartic experience of being able to take ownership over these difficult and sometimes painful stories, to share them with an audience and with fellow artists, and to really be heard and seen for who they are. So I was hoping to create that kind of brave space where we could work at the intersection between artistic and personal revelation in order to ultimately grow not just as artists, but as people. I suspected that it was going to be a lot of responsibility on me as the director and the writer to both improve the script and also set the terms of engagement for everybody, to make sure that that kind of intimacy can be achieved and that it can be achieved in a safe and productive way. But of course, it was completely different from imagining having to do that to actually doing it. There were a lot of surprises in the course of the rehearsal process and a lot of adjustments that had to be made in order to make sure that everybody was taken care of. One of the things that was wonderful and surprising to some degree was the kind of overwhelming sense of mission and purpose that I think the entire team and also the university community was feeling surrounding the project. I was really blown away and impressed by the courage and the bravery and the willingness to really live in and embody these difficult circumstances that all the students and collaborators represented. That being said, of course, there were instances where that material was getting to people and feeling very personal. So not halfway, earlier than that. So a little bit into the rehearsal process, I realized that it wasn't enough to just keep encouraging people to be open and communicative about the things they were going through, but that I actually needed to institute some policies to make that happen and to make that easier for people who may not be able to always tell how they were feeling and the degree of emotional turmoil that they were in. So at that point, I collaborated with psychologist Thomas Brzezinski, who was a consultant on the project throughout, in order to develop a start of rehearsal and end of rehearsal ritual. This ritual allowed for people to create shared focus at the beginning of the rehearsal, set an intention for the work of the day in order to pursue the work with clarity and with presence. At the end of the rehearsal, and that was the more crucial part, we would spend the last 20 minutes or so getting back into our bodies, present in the room, and appreciating both the challenges and the lessons learned during the day, and also celebrating the victories of overcoming these challenges and sharing that with other people who could again witness that and appreciate that and hold each other up. And the most crucial part probably was saying goodbye to the work for the night, which, every student had a little solo desk that they sat in for the duration of the play. So the final part of the ritual was saying goodbye to the little desk as a stand-in to the character, which was very sweet to watch and also turned out to be very effective in helping people release the character for the night.
I actually remember the moment when you told me about these new rituals that you were going to start implementing. I was driving you to rehearsal, and you were telling me about how we were going to start having these beginning rituals and these ending rituals. And one of the ending rituals was that the actors would take their desks, their student desks that were part of the set, and they would close them up and put them away. And it was so symbolic and effective because not only were they putting away their desk, but they were putting away their role in the show. And then, they would leave rehearsal, go about their lives, and then they would come back the next night and we would do it all over again. But, I definitely, and I'm sure other people felt this way too, there was this lightheartedness that started to come from these rituals. And I just think they were extremely effective. So then, what were your thoughts when you finally were able to see the play mesh with the costumes and the technical elements and the set? And in your mind, how did that all come together?
Let's see. Coming up with the set design for the show was one of the most challenging things for the production, because the primary action, the sort of basic level of reality in the play, is the writer's world, because we meet the writer on kind of a dark night of the soul, where he is struggling with this early work of art that has caused him a lot of pain and a lot of turmoil, and with the decision of what to do in order to mitigate the impact of that work that to him felt very important and urgent, but maybe hurting people in the real world. And in the course of doing that, he confronts his protagonist directly and also re-experiences the events within the novel. So the set design both had to be abstract and simple enough that it could represent the writer's study and also his mind space, but also very quickly and efficiently turn into a classroom for 8 students. So we went on a journey to figure out exactly what this mind space might look like, and ended up creating this kind of an abstracted, simple set that had a wall stacked with papers, kind of like a madman's study, a writer's desk that eventually ended up doubling as the teacher's desk, and then sort of the detritus of a school shooting in the shape of chairs and the students' belongings that then ended up being straightened out in order to help us enter into the classroom.
Right.
Seeing the set in person was definitely really helpful in being able to contextualize the experience, and also engage with the transformative possibilities of the space that can track the transformations in the play. The biggest sort of scenic element, strangely enough, was a black screen that kind of disappeared. So you didn't really see it, you just saw this void on stage up until projections activated. And then it was almost like this idea of seeing inside a character's mind and entering that new reality. So I was very pleased with how these ideas played together scenically. The costumes were absolutely beautiful, and also we went on a journey. There are many journeys that were gone on, because the 70s color palette and the 70s style of fashion, which we were trying to embody because the majority of the action of the play was happening at that time, is a little bit jarring to my contemporary Eastern European eye. So we had to sort of juggle both historical accuracy and also artistic priorities in watching 10 characters on stage there the whole time. I thought that the costume designer did a brilliant job in capturing the individuality of each character. One of the fun sort of things that became a running joke in the course of the tech process had to do with finding the perfect plaid shirt for Charlie, the protagonist of the novel, because we were looking for something that both looked casual and period appropriate, and there were a lot of plaid shirts in the 70s, so that was not so difficult, but also could look kind of iconic and set the character up as a more mythological figure and a real figure in turn. We went through many variations, some of them more Paul Bunyan reminiscent than others, until we ultimately went in on one that we liked. We were afraid we had scarred the poor actor who was trying on all these shirts forever and put him off of plaid shirts for his lifetime, but it seemed like he was okay. So that whole experience definitely concretized my vision for the play, and there were a lot of things that were delightful to witness and also interesting to reckon with. Such as, for example, finding out how to get a real actor off stage very quickly and replace them with something that could stand in for their dead body for, again, the 2-hour duration of the play. And that is easier in theory than it is in practice. And we went through many different iterations of that as well. Ultimately, though, I think the biggest benefit of being able to see the production with all of these technical elements was to truly get a sense for what in the script was not working because it just hadn't materialized in a physical way yet, and what was not working because there was emotional and psychological connective tissue missing from the script and score itself. And there is a giant list of improvements and deepenings of characters and circumstances that Fred Kennedy, the composer, and I are interested in making, and that we've already sort of gotten started on. Most of them are kind of minor, some of them are pretty major, so we'll see what we get to.
So then, going off of that, what are your next steps for Rage? Some script changes and some music work, and then what?
The complicated thing about developing a play with music is that it is close to impossible to do it in the abstract, which is why, again, this production was so useful, but also why moving forward with the show is a little bit challenging. I think that the next step would be for the composer and I to do some individual work in creating a new draft of the script, record demos for the different songs so that we could give anybody who's interested in the show and in producing the show a more real and more emotionally vibrant experience of what that would be like. Because it's very different to just read it on paper and hear all the songs. We are hoping that we can continue to perform the show, certainly at the professional level eventually, because I think that professional actors could certainly bring a lot of depth and a lot of insight into these characters. And the resources, the technical resources of a larger organization could also make it easier for us to focus on the jobs that we do have and less on the organizational scope of the whole thing. That being said, though, this experience of doing Rage for the first time at a university felt so personally meaningful and artistically transformational that we are certainly interested in continuing to make the show available or to do the show at other universities, because the conversations that the show brought up in the community were so deep and exciting and also unexpected in so many different ways. So using the play as a catalyst to stay engaged in the conversation about prevention and gun violence and mental health in vulnerable populations of young people, I think can really flourish through having that kind of theatrical backing.
So, Beth, before we go, can you just share with us different ways in which you are continuing to stay creative during this time and share some ideas that you may have for other people?
I'm certainly figuring it out as I go. One of the things that I have started doing, which Michael Pemberton, one of the professional actors who was participating in Rage, put me onto, was writing these morning pages. All that means is that in the morning when you wake up, the first thing that you do is you sit down and you write 3 handwritten pages or 1,500 words if you're typing. And those can be creative work, or they could just be journal pages about the things that you're thinking about and that you're experiencing. Even if nothing dramatically exciting happens artistically in those pages, the great thing about them is that it can be a way for you to clear your mind and actually prepare yourself to approach your other artistic work with more focus and presence. So that's one strategy. I have certainly started reconceiving of aspects of Rage and actually having various Zoom and Skype conversations with the students and other actors who are members of the cast has been infinitely useful in getting their perspective on what it feels like to have lived in this character for such a long time and where they may have noticed opportunities for that character to deepen and grow. There have been surprising and beautiful revelations through these conversations that I'm really excited to implement. The main challenge, I'm sure that as other people have figured out, is creating a schedule and a routine for yourself to actually get the work done. And that's something that I struggle with, but also something that I feel like I'm getting better at. And I think it's all really based on what can give a person the kind of meaning that really can organize their life and their experience in what feels like a very vast amount of unorganized time. So engaging in something that brings you artistic satisfaction and passion, I think, is the best way to make sure that you're staying in touch with your artistic core.
Well, thank you for sharing those wonderful ideas with us, and thank you so much for taking the time out and joining me today. I am so excited for people to learn more about Rage and hopefully follow it as it continues to grow. It is such an important show, and it is going to start those conversations that need to be had.
Thank you for giving me the chance to revisit this and reminisce about this very important and meaningful journey that we went on together, Lauren.
Yes, and I feel the same way. I am just so lucky and blessed to have gone on this journey with you, and I'm so hopeful for what the future has in store for Rage. All right, Beth, thank you so much for speaking with me today, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.
You too.
Thank you for joining us on Face to Face. We would like to thank our sponsors, Oak Tree Development and the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and Brad Ross for the themed music. You can follow us on legacytheaterct.org.